Bootstrap version 4 is out. Now, before we actually get started, I will say that this video is actually a section of a much bigger course. So that course will be linked in the description below, and once it's out, you'll actually see that it is one of those sections. Sure, we might add something to it, but for the most part, we want to learn about Bootstrap as soon as possible so we can integrate it into any of our current Django projects, and we didn't want to have to wait until this course was out to allow you guys to go ahead and do that. So if you have any questions, let me know in the description below, but let's actually go ahead and jump into the course now. So let's go ahead and install Bootstrap into our Django project. Regardless of where you are in the e-commerce project, we're going to do this from scratch as a way to reference just the Bootstrap related stuff going forward. So on getbootstrap.com, just go ahead and click Getting Started, and we're going to be using this starter template. We're also going to be using the CDN versions of the CSS and JavaScript to make things load faster. So before I actually copy all that, I'm going to go into my templates folder for my e-commerce project. I'm going to make a new folder and call it Bootstrap. And inside of that folder, I'm just going to go ahead and say example.html. And let's go ahead and grab this starter template now. I'm going to go ahead and copy that, paste it in here. We're not going to change anything on this right now. But what I will do is go into my e-commerce URLs because I need to be able to render this page out. This is literally the only thing we'll be doing with Django. So from django.views.generic, import template view, and then right below any of these pages, actually right below register, I'll go ahead and bring in Bootstrap. And we're going to use the template view. So I'm going to get rid of the name and everything. So just do template view as view, and then we write our template name equaling to bootstrap / example.html. Right? So that's going to match that path there. And all we want to do now is verify this works. So we'll go to Bootstrap, hit enter, and there we go. So we've got Bootstrap actually working, like the page showed up. And if we view the page source by control clicking or right clicking, we see that Bootstrap's in. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and keep going. So we're pretty much done with the Django URLs for this section. We're done with all Django related stuff, and we're just going to be working with the example.html. Of course, something I did skip in that last one is I want to make sure my Django server is running, and that definitely is. Okay, so now we want to talk about how the Bootstrap stuff works. And by default, you put everything into something called a container. So you have two different classes for this. So it's container and another div class called container fluid. So we want to put all of our content in one of these two areas. Now, what this means is it's just allowing us to actually organize our content. So if I refresh in here and take out that hello world, it's gone, right? Let's go ahead and go back into getbootstrap.com into documentation. We're going to go into components, and we're going to just grab some of these alerts here. So I'm going to grab this first alert, copy and paste it into my container. And then I'm going to grab the second alert and copy and paste that into my container fluid. Okay, so let's tab some of this stuff back so we know where we're working here. And save it. And let's go back into Bootstrap and take a look. This is literally the difference between the two. Container fluid has a full width no matter what size the browser is. Container, on the other hand, breaks down, it goes full width when it becomes more of like a mobile device. See, if it's the size of a tablet or your desktop, it gives some padding on the outside. You'll see this a lot with different websites. And this full-on container allows us to do a full width no matter the size of the browser. Now again, these things are different for wherever you're going. If we look at Bootstrap, our course for this right here, if I click on Getting Started, what do you think this container is? Is it the standard container or container fluid? Hopefully you, just by looking at this, you can kind of guess. And the answer is it's a container fluid. So everything inside of there, everything inside of container fluid goes the full width. Everything inside of just container has some extra padding on the outside. And if you want to know the actual width itself, you can inspect the element on that container. And we see when it's a minimum width of 1200 pixels, that is when the actual device that we're on is 1200 pixels, this is 1140 by 50. So the height isn't as important, but it is the width that is. So it does change depending on what it is, right? So if I'm a little bit smaller, it goes to 960, but then it has this gap on the outside of it, which is pretty cool. I mean, it makes things a little bit easier on us when it comes to designing things. So you have two choices. You either do container fluid, which is a full width container, or you do container, which is not a full width on most sides. Container is something I typically use for applications that I think are going to be used on both mobile and desktop roughly evenly. If you're using just mobile, I think container fluid will probably be the one you'll end up using a lot of. But again, it's going to depend on the design. Like, for example, with Coding for Entrepreneurs, this e-commerce section, like this entire course is in, or not the entire course, but the sections are in this container fluid. And when we break it down, it actually shows you that it's not completely using one or the other inside of the entire project. So it's definitely different for each one. So it's good to understand that there are some pluses and minuses of each one. Now we are going to be going off of both of these so you can see the results of them going forward. If you have any questions, let us know. Otherwise, let's keep going. So now we're going to talk about columns and rows. And I'm going to do that by showing you a spreadsheet first and see how this is sort of complemented using Bootstrap. And I think this is where they thought of it, but can't say for sure, but I do know that this is how they use it. Now, when you look at a spreadsheet, always you'll see is columns, right? So column A, B, and C, and so on, and then rows, 1 to however many. This is actually very nice for formatting because we can, especially in a spreadsheet, we can make them bigger. We can add more columns and we can add more rows. Now with spreadsheets, it's typical to scroll left and right, but websites, it's not. Websites, you usually just go up and down. That's what's typically done. Yes, you've probably seen websites that you scroll left and right, but you don't see them very often. So what that means is we want to actually fix the idea of how many columns we have, right? So right now I'm going to go to 12 columns all the way across in this spreadsheet just to illustrate the point. So right now it's 12 columns across. Now, what does this container representation look like? Like, what do you think of this right here? Is this a container or container fluid? Hopefully, if you compare that to this, it looks a lot more like container fluid. And that's what it is. Right now, it's completely flush to the entire page from left to right, but there's 12 columns in here, right? So that was denoted by when I actually made it bigger. You can see in that right corner there, it says 12 columns. You can also count them if you wanted. But this is how Bootstrap works. It's already divided up into 12 columns. So when you're imagining these containers, just think of them already in these 12 columns. They're already there. They're made there for us. So the amount of rows doesn't matter, but it's the columns that do. So let's go ahead and actually create a similar idea inside of Bootstrap. First off, I'm going to do it inside of the container. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and underneath this alert primary, I'm going to make a new div class of row, right? So I'm creating a row here, much like in this. And then inside of that row, I have columns. So I'm going to make a first one being a column. And I'm actually going to put this alert back inside of this column. And now I'm going to get rid of that old alert. Okay, so I have one row, one column, and one container. Now what's going to happen? If I refresh in here, it looks exactly the same. Okay, what if I made another column? I'm just going to go ahead and copy that column and just make another one. This time I'm going to just change the coloring by changing the class to secondary, right? So the alert secondary, alert primary, so on. So now I have some variance, so we can see it. I refresh. Whoa, there's 2 columns in there, and they're taking up this entire container, right? Because these columns are inside of a row, this is how it will work. Now, if I do this 12 times, so actually just a few more times, right? I can refresh in here, and I see that 1, 2, 3, 4, I have 8 across here. It's not actually giving me 12 across, but this is because Django or Bootstrap wants to do standard layouts to make it look a little bit better. There's 8 across, but there's actually 10 items here. We want 12 items because I told you it's going to be 12 across. So we're going to do 1 more there. Okay, so now it's 8 up here, 4 down here. We want to change this, but as you see, it already looks pretty nice, right? The formatting of it is very nice. And if I break it down, that formatting continues to be nice. This is built into Bootstrap all the way down to this, right? So it's trying to make it as nice as possible depending on the size of the actual item. So if you think of each one of these as a column that could be up to 12, right? So I can actually change these to being column 1 to 12. So if I add that dash, it changes the actual size of it. So if I do it as 12 and refresh in here, no matter what, it's going to take that full row width. If I change it to 1, no matter what, it's always 1. So you have it divided by default into 12 columns. So I'm going to go ahead and put all of these in as 1. So let's go ahead and just copy and paste all the way down for each one of these columns. Little tedious, but it's to show you this is how it's actually laid out. If I try to add 1 more column to this, what do you think it's going to do? I save it or refresh, it goes on a new row. So it's not technically in a new div class of row, but Bootstrap makes it automatically go to a brand new row because of that formatting. If I break it all the way down, notice they are all still there. That's because column -1 is the minimum size. No matter what, it's going to be that width. It's going to be a 1 column wide. And the width of that column changes depending on the browser size. Also depending on the container that it's in, right? So if I actually copied this entire thing all the way up to the row and put it into the container fluid, we save that, we refresh. I'm going to actually delete that last extra row or column on both of these so we don't have any confusion here. But what we see is there's 12 across here and there's 12 across here. We can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 columns. And it depends on what container it's in and how it's actually going to render. Really, really cool. So this also means that I can play around with these numbers, column 1 and so on, which we will do, but we're not going to do it quite yet. I just want you to understand that this is very similar to like a spreadsheet, right? So we have a set number of columns. We can't make more columns, otherwise they'll just move down to that next row. So by default, it's always 12 columns wide. Always, always, always. So that means that every container inside of here has to equal up to that. Otherwise, it'll go to the next one. We'll see what that means in a moment. But hopefully you understand this. If you don't, let us know. Otherwise, let's keep going. So now it's time to talk about how the column sizes actually work. So think of it in terms of widths, not necessarily heights. So it doesn't really matter how tall it is in some cases, but it's more about how wide it is. And that's really what we're concerned with, because it's also more true for the browser size itself, right? So if you're on a mobile device, it's going to be not very wide. If you're on a desktop, it will be pretty wide. So that's where the columns really shine, is understanding the context between those two things. But before we understand it with different browser sizes, let's just look at these column sizes and see how they work. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to create a new container and row above all of this stuff. So I'm just going to say div class equals to container. And of course you could use container fluid here too to see that, but we're just going to stick with the regular div class of container. And then we'll do div class of row because columns have to be inside of rows to work properly. And then I'm just going to go ahead and copy that very first one. And what I'm going to do instead of having it at 1, I'm just going to call it column. We save that and we refresh in here. And what it does is it takes the entire 12 columns. So saying just column in this case is very similar to saying column 12. That's true until I add another column. So if I added another column in here and said like column 8, what size will this column likely take? What number would go in here? Remember, 12 is the magic number. So what's 12 minus 8? That's what you hopefully are thinking. So if I refresh in here, I now see that, look, this is 4 columns across and this is 8. So that's what this is showing me down here. So again, I can actually explicitly write that, which in many cases you will explicitly write it because in many cases you want to know for sure that's the distribution, right? 12 and 8. And this is true no matter what the size of the browser is. It's a little bit more evident by looking below here, what's going on. And that's, I mean, even that is still a little challenging because there's a gap here. There's still going to be a gutter there. But when we make it a little bit bigger, it kind of shows us how these columns are working. So if I change the height on these, so I'll just say style, minimum height being 800 pixels on both of these. Well, let's do it on only one for a second. We see that this row or this column is going to be that minimum height, right? So that's the same if I put it into the alert itself. It shows me that this column is that height. And if I look at the column on the left of it, it is also that height. So it's making that entire row that height. So we're already starting to see the basis of any given website, right? So let's go ahead and just add another row above here with the same stuff. So I'm just copying and pasting here, but I'll just add a column 12 and then we'll do an alert secondary. And we'll just call this navigation or just nav, right? So I'm already starting to see the basis of a site. I have the navigation bar up top. I have a sidebar or potentially a sidebar and main content area and even a footer down here, right? So the structure is there. Now, if I break it down, it's showing me that same structure. So this is really good for all sorts of things, but you definitely want to play around with these numbers, right? So you might want this to be 2 and this to be 10. And when we see that, we see much bigger. So I have one left sidebar. What if I wanted a right sidebar? Well, let's bring this back to being 8. And what do you know? We add another column small 2 or column 2. So a column of size 2. And there you go. So again, it breaks it down however we'd like. And I can add that minimum height to these other alerts so we can really see it. And now you see that these are all broken down just a little bit differently than your standard site might be. And again, it does have these gutters. So if we inspect the element here and we look at any given column, I see that there is this green line around it. And if I go into these computed styles, I see that the padding is 15. And that's what's called a gutter. So we can actually get rid of those gutters by going into our row itself and say no dash gutters, save that, and refresh in here. And what do you know? The padding on the actual column goes away. So this puts our nav right next to each other, or I mean our little alerts right next to each other if you wanted that. Now, of course, the alerts themselves have stuff in there. So if I just put a paragraph tag in here and said hello world, we'll see the difference coming through. See how the hello world is right on the line there where the alert is still indented a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that for now. That is having your column sizes. Now, there are so many other things that you can do with this, but I want you to play around with it now to see and understand how these sizes work. And the next one, we'll talk about how you can offset these things and really put the columns in different places as you may see fit. Okay, so now let's talk about offsets and ordering. So when we actually have a size, right? So here we have column 2 and then column 8. Well, what if I wanted a row that didn't have this extra column 2? Like, what if I wanted some breaks in between these, right? I want this to be on the right-hand side and I want this to be on the left-hand side. So to do this, we actually use ML auto, so margin left, so left of this item, auto, or MR, as in margin right, auto. We'll look at this in a second, but if I save this and take a look, refresh, it brings that over to the right, and it brings it at every size of the browser. If I get rid of that and do margin right auto, save that, it refreshes. So this is going to be based off of, how far you want this to be to the actual left. So if I actually added in another one, so div class equals to column 1, for example, save that, refresh. Notice that margin is still automatically being created because it's coming off of this unit right here. So I want to make sure that that margin's there, and this is going to change based off of that margin. So this allows me to offset things as I see fit, right? By using either margin auto or margin right auto or margin right left. So this is much more useful when you're trying to just build out a sidebar and you always want to have this content like way over here. So let's actually see something that it might make sense. I'm just going to undo all of the changes we just made with the margin items. And instead, I'm going to use something a little bit more practical. I'm going to create another row. So we'll say div class equals to row. And I'm going to do div class equals to column 1. And we'll just say home. And then we'll do div class equals to column 2. And we'll just say actions, something like that. And in this case, it would make sense to do margin left auto. So this is on the right-hand side. Of course, it's hard to tell where it is there, but if we refresh over here, we now see how that's coming through, right? We have our row with these different columns. And if we wanted to actually align with our alerts or with everything else, let's just go ahead and put those in alerts themselves so we can also see the coloring for it. Otherwise, we would probably change this overall. Okay, so another thing, maybe you put this as a search bar and you have this as 4, and then you do an input type equals to text, and we'll just add a class of form control, and we'll say placeholder equals to search. We save that, refresh, and there, now I have this little search bar here where it just adds that extra functionality, and perhaps I don't even want this column there. So let's get rid of it. We save it, refresh, and there I now have this aligned to the right exactly where I might want it as far as the search bar is concerned. Let's even take it out of that alert to make it even better looking. And there you go. So it has this search functionality. It's right where I would probably want it as far as the margin is concerned. And the next part would be the ordering, right? So right now I have it where this is the left sidebar and this is the right sidebar. Well, what if I wanted it the reverse? All you have to do is order and then a kind of a number offset. And I'll explain this in just a second, but let's say order 1, order 12. We save that, refresh in here, and it changes these in a different way because this one is not even ordered. So we're just going to say order 6. We save that, refresh, and now I've reversed those. Right? So we can see this by saying first item, middle, and last, right? So we can actually look at this ordering. Save that, a refresh there, last, middle, first. No matter what, we break it down, those stay exactly where they're supposed to be. So this is cool, but here is the sort of fundamental flaw with all this, and that is the browser size. So if I change the browser size, I probably want to change how these things look. Whether it's the margin or the ordering, I might want to adjust those things depending on the browser size. So that means we have to look into what's called breakpoints. That's what we'll do in the next one. So now it's time to make use of breakpoints. Now what breakpoints are there for is the size of the browser. So by default, it's going off of this size. It's going off of the mobile size because Bootstrap is a mobile first front-end library, right? So that means that they want you to design for the mobile experience before you design for anything else. Now, designing for the mobile experience on video is not as pleasing as designing for the desktop experience because we're creating this on a desktop. So I'm actually going to bring it down and design for the actual smallest option, which is going to be our mobile device. As we see here, this is not a great design for a mobile system at all. Now, without going into too much of the Bootstrap stuff, I really want to focus just on the breakpoints and how we can update this. So all I want to do here is I want to change how this stuff looks right here. First and foremost, my search bar is way too small. In fact, I might want to have that all the way across, right? Especially at a very small level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into that search bar, which was right here, and I'm going to change this to column 12. Notice that it says margin left auto. I refresh in there. That margin left is still there, but it didn't do anything. But I now have this search bar that's looking better, or at least it looks better than it did. But this creates a problem, because if I make it bigger, it starts to be too big of a search bar. So this is where breakpoints come in, is I can say at some breakpoint, so some arbitrary size, let's just say SM, as in the smallest size after the smallest size, right? So you've got a mobile device, and then the next biggest size, I can reset how big this thing's going to be. And let's say, for instance, I reset it to being 2. I'm doing this for dramatic effect, but we'll see what it does. If I make this just a little bit bigger, and stretch it out, and then eventually, let's make sure I save and refresh, but let's bring it back down and do that one more time. It's at 12 right here. It's going all the way across right here. So I bring it bigger, and then boom, tiny, right? And that's because I set a breakpoint for this. That's not a good breakpoint. In fact, even at this size, I probably don't want it there. I probably still want it all the way across, right? This is probably a bigger size. Either it's a mobile device like a cell phone, or it's a big cell phone, or even it's a small tablet. I still might want to have that all the way across. So I still might want it to be 12. So I refresh that, and there it is. So then the next size after that would be medium. So, and that's MD. And here I might want to say 6. Okay, let's see what that does. I'm going to refresh in here. I saved everything, of course. And refresh, and then let's open up that browser a little bit. And then, okay, yeah, that's starting to look a little bit more like what we want to see, at least for the search bar, right? But then when I get bigger and bigger, that's too big of a search bar. So then the next one would be LG, as in large, and what size I want that to be. And I believe I started it with 4, so let's put it back to being 4. Okay, so now it's at 4, so it actually changes to the size we want it to be depending on the actual browser size. This is true whether it's on an actual mobile device or even on your desktop itself. So this is good if I'm doing stuff like I'm doing right now, right? I can still look at that search bar and understand what's going on, and it's not all weird like this first item one or like it first initially was. So these are all of the breakpoints. It starts with the absolute smallest one possible, and then it goes up from there. So at column small 12, I'm actually not changing anything, so I don't have to include it, right? We'll see that in a second. I'll actually not include it in a second just so you can see. But now I want to go to the next part, and that is this last item here. So we set it where we actually added this minimum height requirement. I'm going to get rid of that. I don't want that minimum height requirement anymore. And that's for the first item as well as the last item. Of course, that ordering is still there, which is something we will discuss in this one. But let's get rid of that styling. So then we save that and those go back up to kind of where they were. Okay, so this last item, we will actually address that last. The first item we want to address now. So what I actually want to do on the very smallest is I want to put this first item or this item here on the bottom. So we'll call this, instead of first item, we'll just call it bottom content. And we refresh there and we see bottom content here. Now, if you remember back to how our columns sizes work, I can actually change this to being 12. If I change that to being 12, what happens? I refresh, it sends it to the bottom. Very nice. Because the reason for that has to do with the ordering, of course, but the next reason is because column 8 plus column 2 equals to 10, so there's really only room for 2 here. If you make a column bigger than 2, it just goes to the next line, also not quite the next row, so it's not create a new class of row, but it goes to the next line and just bumps it down. That's really nice because then we have this ability. But when I make it bigger, let's just make it bigger, it's still on the bottom. Like it stays on the bottom no matter what size. So there is a size that I might want to change it, right? So going back here, I'm going to change it a column medium back to being what it was, which was 2, right? So we save that, refresh in here. And now if I change the size, it goes back to 2 right there, right? And notice that I didn't have to put the small item on there. Okay, so let's bring that back down. That still doesn't look great, right? So I'm at medium. That doesn't look great. It only really looks good at large or LG. So I'm going to change that back to being LG. And in fact, I want this same thing to happen with that last item. Exactly the same in the same way. But instead of it being last, I want it to be on the top content item. We save that, refresh there. What do you know? The top content is there. I scroll down. There's my bottom content. And finally, the middle content is still in the middle, but it's not going all the way across. And perhaps I don't want it to go all the way across. Perhaps I want it to go partially across and have some gap there. So let's change it to column 10. I refreshed in here. And now what I want to do is I need to create some margin on what side of this? Well, I need to create some margin on the left here. So what I'll do is ML, as in margin left, auto. We save that, refresh. Now it's giving me too much on the left. What if I did MR auto? And we save that again. There we go. So now it's on both sides, right? So get rid of one of them. It's still over there. So if I have both of them, it puts it nice in the middle for me, and it's actually definitely in the middle. This is also true if I said column 11, right? Refresh that, still the same. And we could kind of play around with our numbers up here even to have that same effect, right? So I could even say, I'm going to grab this, and this will also be column small 11, right? So I refresh in there. This is the bottom content, so let's go to the bottom content. What do you know? There it is. But if I go bigger, the middle one is still pretty big, right? But if I scroll to the bottom content is no longer. So that means in the middle one, I have to account for these LG sizes. So going back and making it a little bit smaller, we call it LG 10. And we refresh in here, and there it's showing us 10. That's a mistake. That should be 8, not 10. We refresh, and now my content is showing up again, and I can break these things down accordingly. Very cool. And in sort of an accordion fashion too, right? So it's actually changing based off of some stuff. Now, of course, I don't actually want those to be 11. I would rather them be 12 because that makes a lot more sense. And what even makes more sense is not actually updating or changing the order, but I'll leave them in here just so you can see the order changes, and I'll even leave it at 11 for now as well, so you can see that too. But that is the fundamental basis of how these things work. Now, I will say that you can also, let's go ahead and just copy some of these rows in here. You can also use this content inside of other content, right? So I can actually write another row. So I have the row opening. Let's go ahead and tab this in a little bit so you can see that. We've got the row opening here, and then we've got some of these other columns. And I can leave them like at auto, right? So if I did column auto, and then this being column 6, I can refresh in here, and it actually is doing the same thing. I break it down, it's doing it based off of all sorts of stuff. Now I threw in a new one in there called column auto. Column auto does based off of whatever's in the content. So if I break that content down, it's going to be that size. It's going to be roughly that size, that is. Where just column will automatically fill in whatever's missing for this other one, right? So if I did this as column 10, just a plain old column is going to either take the entire thing, like in this case it's taking the entire thing, or if I did something smaller like 4, it's going to fill up the 6 that's missing. So this is where you're going to, or excuse me, it's going to fill up the 8 that are missing. And this is where every single item, it's better to be explicit about the item, like as in the exact size, than just kind of inferring by using column or column auto even. I don't particularly like using those automatic fillers for this for the majority of content. So one of the things you may have been wondering is like, hey, what the heck? How is it that I thought there was only 12 columns? How is it that this is working like that? Well, that's how you can nest things. You can actually nest 12 columns inside of another column, no matter how big that column is too. So going back in here, I'm going to nest those other 12 and refresh, and there they are. They are nested as those 12 items, right? But of course they are explicitly column 1, otherwise they would be formatted slightly different, but it is still able to nest them. And of course you can nest them in that too. So you can put other columns inside of there, and I'll do it because it's going to be a little bit ridiculous, but I have now these 12 in that last one. I'm not going to actually keep this there, but I wanted to show you that you can do it, but in this case it's just not formatted well at all because just how the content is. But and also you probably would never do something like that. And in fact, you probably wouldn't ever do something like this even. But it is important to know that, yeah, you can actually put these things, nest them inside of other containers or other columns or even other rows. So what if I did div class equals to container fluid inside of a column for this data? And we'll just go ahead and close off that div. We refresh. Well, actually nothing changes, right? So the column fluid will work when it's on the, or sorry, container fluid, not column fluid, but container fluid will work on the outside of being already in something. So you can't really nest a container fluid as far as I know. So that is it for really dealing with those breakpoints. This is rather a big concept. So if you're unclear about this at all, definitely take a look at the grid layout. Read more about it and even play with their examples, because this will factor into how well you can learn and understand these things. And you can also see where the breakpoints are, the actual breakpoints for the sizes of the browser, right? So extra small is where it starts, and then it just goes up from there. If you're coming from an older version of Bootstrap, notice that there is no XS anymore. It's just column. So when you design these columns, if you always want it to be at a certain size, you can just use column dash. The other thing, if you are coming from an older version of Bootstrap, is you use margin auto instead. So margin right auto or margin left auto, you use that instead of using an offset. So you may have seen like column small offset 3. You don't need to do that anymore. You just use margin left auto or margin right auto. And the last thing with the margin auto is you can use breakpoints there as well. So if you actually only want that margin there at certain points, this is what you would do. So if I said margin, let's do margin large auto right here, and I'm going to change this for left, and I'm going to change this back to being, let's say like 5. We refresh in here and notice there is margin on both sides actually. In the bottom content, it's probably likely the bottom content has some stuff, and it does. So if I got rid of those, it brings it over, right? So it's nice and aligned for me. Let's go ahead and get rid of that one even. And there it is. Okay, so that's the spacing we want to see. When I break it down, it goes away, right? So once I get to about medium, that's when it's no longer there anymore. And then those other margin breakpoints actually happen, which I'm going to bring back in. But those you can do. You can also do that with ordering as well. So again, that's where the documentation really shines, when you have a better understanding of how to use these things. Then use the docs as reference. I do not recommend trying to memorize these things. Instead, what I recommend you do is to understand contextually what you're trying to do, and then use the documentation to solidify all the things that you're doing. We now have a very, very solid foundation of Bootstrap. From here, we can add some things and understand a little bit more about it. But as far as the foundation is concerned, this is it. I mean, you have to understand the grid to really implement anything else in Bootstrap. So if you have any questions on what we did here, please let us know. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next one. So one of the things you may have noticed or may have nagged you a little bit was this. So we don't actually have any padding. It's so nice and flush on some of our content. That's not how I want it to be, right? So I could inspect the element here and take a look, and we see that, you know, there is a row there. It's just not really giving me any spacing. The row above it does. And the reason that it's doing that, the reason there is spacing altogether, is because of the alert. The alert has some padding it has margin on the bottom of it. Now, how do we actually do that same sort of thing here? So if I actually click on this alert, I can see on the right-hand side here that it says alert, padding, margin bottom is 1 rem. So 1 rem, you can also change it to being something like 1 pixel to just get an idea of what that looks like. And we can just adjust these things going forward. But I don't actually want to have manual things. I want to avoid doing custom CSS as much as possible, or even SCSS. You want to avoid adding custom code as much as possible, but still get the effects that you're looking for. Luckily for us, Bootstrap has this thing called spacing. Now, we've already actually used this a little bit. So if we look at our code, we see that we use ML auto. And of course, that stands for margin left auto, right? We're actually setting margin left auto. And in here, this spacing actually handles it for us, right? So using the same sort of concept that we did with the columns, we can also do that with, you know, margin left auto. We've talked about that. But you can also go even further with how all of these things are designed. We can do it with margin, but we can also do it with padding. So let's say, for instance, I wanted to pad this even more. So I wanted this navbar to be just more padded on the top and the bottom. So what I can actually do is I can say padding X or PX. So let's go ahead and look at what X stands for. So that's actually left and right. We might want that, or we might want PY and some number. So let's say, for instance, 4. PY4. So this would be padding top and bottom 4. If I refresh, notice my nav goes up and down, and we can actually see what PY4 is. It's 1.5 rem on the top and bottom. Well, what if we did PY6? I refresh that. I don't actually have anything, so it breaks at PY6. What number does it go up to at the most? And that is 5. So we can go up to PY5. We refresh there, and there is our new padding. That is huge padding, not necessarily something I want, but it is there. So we can see in how that's played around. Now I can use this same padding concept anywhere, right? So if I put it on my row, I use PY5. Notice my row now has padding of 5 on both top and bottom. But if you also notice, like if we put our row to have some sort of background color, let's say BG light, I'll explain that later, but we have some background color. Notice there's still this white gap here, right? That white gap is still the margin from this top navigation. So what I want to do is, instead of removing that top nav like padding or margin. Instead of touching that, because I don't need to, I'm going to go ahead and change how this row functions. So I'm going to get rid of that PY. And instead what I'll do is I'll say so margin, and I want it to be on the bottom. Well, how do I do that? I come in here and I see that there's sides, right? So there's T for top, B for bottom, left, and so on. So I can actually say MB as in margin bottom, and I want it to be the same as the margin up here, right? So I want this same margin. So I'm going to actually go into that nav, into the alert, and I see that the margin bottom is 1 REM. We already looked at that, but I wanted to see it again. And I'm just going to look at what it is. So here is the different classes, right? So margin 0, spacer times 0.25, 0.5, and so on. So I'm guessing it's margin bottom 3. So let's try that. MB3. We refresh in here. Notice that the spacing is roughly the same. Let's just go to our row. We've got our row here with MB3 on it. Margin bottom 1 REM. It's exactly the right spacing. So I'm going to get rid of that BG light because we don't want that on our row anymore. We might want it on our column, right? So BG light gives us a light background on that column itself if we wanted some sort of background. I actually don't want a background, so I'm going to get rid of it completely. But now we can play around more with the other sizes, right? So I have ML auto and MR auto. Well, I can actually do MX auto. So that's left and right. Refreshed, nothing seems to have changed. I space it down all the way where it would see that it changed, and what do you know, it's there. So that just takes place of doing the redundantness of writing, you know, left or right. That the left or right stuff is really good when we need to specify it, but MX Auto, that spacing is there for us. So this is going to take some playing around with. I want you to do that. There are some examples of how this works, and you know, horizontal centering, take a look. MX Auto, that's how it's done. We've already seen that, but we used both ML Auto and MR Auto, but it's very intuitive. So it's actually pretty cool on how this thing works, and it's something that I really wanted to show you before we continue to the next part. Let me know if you have any questions on how this spacing stuff actually works. Otherwise, let's keep going. So now I'm going to jump into the Navbar component. So I'm going to go down to Navbar, and I'm going to actually put this into my project. I'm going to go to their example and just kind of take a look at what's going on here. So we've got a link here called Navbar that's correlated to this, and then I have a few other links actually coming through. So before I actually jump into having that Navbar, I will just scroll down to the brand with the brand image. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this Navbar right here, and we'll go ahead to where we put that original container. I'm actually going to keep it for now, but right above that div class of container, we're putting our Navbar. So I'm going to paste that in there, save it, and then we're going to go ahead and refresh in here. And we see that I've got Bootstrap in here. That image is not actually coming through. That's because of where this is coming from. So we need to actually give a link to it, which is getbootstrap.com/assets. We refresh, and now I've got that link there, right? So this is a very basic Navbar. It only has the brand or the logo, but it does it in a fluid way. So by default, the nav bars are fluid. Now, can we just put the nav into a container? Let's go ahead and take a look. So if I put it into a container and refresh in here, it does bring it in, but notice the color also comes in. So let's actually change the color. I'm going to go into my documentation here real quick and go to colors and look for a different color. So we've got BG, all of these different colors here. So I'm actually going to use BG, let's say BG Info. Okay, so I'm just going to change that color to BG Info so we can really see how this looks. I refresh. Look how easy that was to change that background color. It's actually really, really nice that they've changed it to be like this. Older versions of Bootstraps were just not as easy. So this is cool because it's aligned to everything as we may expected it to be. But what's missing is I actually want this line to go all the way across. I will keep it white on the outside, but I want that line to go literally all the way across. How do I actually go about doing that? So that's where we take the container out of the nav class. So we leave it just like this. So it's just the nav class. It's straight in the body itself. We refresh, it goes back out, but I can go one step further. Is inside of that navbar container, I can actually add in a container itself, and that brings it right in for me. I can go one step further and say div class equals to row and div class equals to column. I'm doing this intuitively. I actually don't know if it's going to work the way I want it to. So column, of course, is going to be interpreted as column 12, and that's what I'll just leave it as. I refresh and nothing changes, right? So it worked exactly the same. So I actually don't need those row and column at all, right? I can just literally leave it into the container. That container div now holds all of the things that I'm going to be putting inside of my navbar. The reason I wanted that line to go all the way across has to do with just breaking it down, right? I want it to look nice and fluid no matter where it is. But I do want the logo over here. You may want it differently, right? You may want it to be a fluid site all together, but that's not exactly what I want. So now what we want to do is add in some links. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's jump into Sublime Text, and we're going to add a UL class called navbar nav. And inside this UL class, they'll have list elements with a class of nav item. And those nav items, if we want to have an href tag or an anchor tag, which we'll just use a hashtag for now, but we'll put this class in as nav link. And then we'll just say like home, and we can repeat this process for, whatever items we want. So like about or contact or products, whatever you'd like here. So we save that and we jump back in and we see, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't look right. And it doesn't. That's because intuitively you might be like, oh, I'm going to make this list of items and I'm going to put them inside of my navbar. But we want these items to actually be collapsible when we, actually use the mobile version, right? Because we should be designing for mobile first. Now, this isn't terrible because my brand's right in the middle and it's, it doesn't look that bad. But once you add a bunch of links on it, then it starts to look a lot different. And also, you probably don't want these links stacked when it's big anyway. So what we're going to do is we're going to add this into a new div, and we'll call it class of, this is collapse, and navbar-collapse. And then we're going to give it an ID. So we'll just say nav bar collapse links or items or, some sort of navbar collapsible thing. And we want to put that in our entire UL class. So when we save that and we refresh in here, those link items go away. So we actually need a button to see those link items. And this is going to be button class equals to navbar toggler. And the type is a button. And data toggle equals to collapse. Data target, as in the ID here. We put an ID of navbar collapse links, right? And then we can use the aria expanded equals to false and aria label. These are some of their defaults, toggle navigation. We save that. I refresh in here, and there is my items actually showing. Got to finish off that button. They shouldn't be showing. So we put that button there, and then we do span class of navbar toggler icon. And there we go. Okay, refresh in there, and there it is. So if I click on it, notice it's actually showing me those links. This is great, more for mobile, right? So when it's on mobile, this looks awesome. This works exactly as you may expect. But when it's large, we don't want to see that. So how do we actually change that? Well, we can look in the documentation and go into components, into navbar, and we can scroll down a little bit to the example, ooh, there's this thing called Navbar Expanded or Navbar Expand, and that's probably what we're looking for. So let's go ahead and grab it and add this class to our navbar. And I'm going to say Navbar Expand Medium or MD. So we refresh in here. What do you know? There's our navigation. When I start to break it down, eventually it goes away. And this MD is the breakpoint as to when it would actually break down. What if I got rid of that MD, Navbar Expand, and I break it down all the way? It doesn't break down. Cool. So that just means that I have this class for actually breaking down the size of my navbar. But we're not quite done yet. We want to actually have a form. So if we go back into our documentation and kind of just scroll down for the forms here and go ahead and copy just the form. So form class, form inline, and we're just going to go ahead and paste it outside of the collapse. I want to paste it outside of that just to see what happens here. We save that. We refresh in here and I get this error, right? Or it's not really an error, but it's just not, it just doesn't look that good. So it's actually not really designed to do it this way. So instead what you're going to do is cut it out and put it inside of that div class. You don't put it into the navbar nav unless you want to, of course, but we put it there and now it's over here. But I actually want this to be over on the right. So how do we do that? Let's go ahead and try margin right, or actually I think it'd be margin left, and we'll say margin left auto. We refresh there, and what do you know? Now it's over there on the right. So our background color is now not looking great for us. So I'm going to have to change that. But really, I mean, I just went off of the documentation for this form. I didn't do a whole lot, right? You could customize it as you want, but documentation is really good. It shows you what you need to do. And when you collapse, you know, it works really well. So going back into that nav bar, I want to change the color. If I scroll down a little bit, I see these different color schemes. So I'm going to actually do the navbar dark with the BG dark, or the background dark. Scroll back up. We've got navbar light with info. Save it as dark. And I refresh. Oops, not in there, but right here. And there you go. You have the ability to have a much better navbar than before, and it collapses for us very nicely. The last thing that you might want to do is actually adding in a drop-down menu. So if we go back to the pretty much the top, actually go back to the top, you should do that. The drop-down menu is not showing up here, so I'm going to just search for drop-down. Notice it says drop-down link. Here it is. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy that itself, and we're going to bring it in to right next to products. And we've got our link here. So we save that, refresh, and there's my drop-down, right? I didn't have to do a whole lot. I added the list item, and it's a drop-down, and it's got a link here with the drop-down toggle, much like this button was the navbar toggle. In this case, it's a drop-down toggle. It has the menu ID here, and then just the various drop-down menu items. So you can change it to probably drop-down menu right. I believe that's, nope, that doesn't work. So maybe it's drop-down menu right, like that. There we go. And, or you could do it left, refresh, and it kind of reorganizes the way your drop-down menu actually shows up. And of course, with the drop-downs themselves, you can actually just look at the drop-down component to understand a little bit more about some of these things, right? So drop-down menu going, let's say, for instance, having it go up. Let's take a look, drop up variation. This is it right here. So we've got drop-down menu, and we want it to go up. Drop-down toggle, toggle direction. Really simply, it says drop up instead of drop down on the button. So right here, it says drop down. We call that drop up. It's going to be kind of weird for the nav bar to drop up, so it actually doesn't allow that to happen, but the angle of the drop down button does show that angle. There might be some more things to it than just that, but you can play around with it. That's just another component, right? It's just using some of the code that they already have that we don't really need to change a whole lot. So we now have our nav bar. It's really, really looking like a website. Of course, there's customizations that we'd still want to do, but this is actually pretty solid in of itself. Now, of course, I no longer need this search bar here because I have it here, but you know, it's good to know that you can do all sorts of things here. If you have any questions, let us know. Otherwise, let's keep going. That's all we're going to cover for the Bootstrap related stuff at this time. We really have everything that we need for the structure of our e-commerce project. And that's really why we kind of took it aside to really jump in and dive into Bootstrap on a more detailed level. Now, if you want to stop now and play around with the documentation, there's nothing wrong with that. We are going to be using Bootstrap going forward, so there will still be more Bootstrap related learning. The purpose of this section, though, was much more about how the layout works, not so much about how the components work or even how the utilities work. It was much more about the layout. And I wanted to get that Navbar layout down so when we actually integrate this into our e-commerce project, it will look just like it does here. So actually in the very next video, the last video of this section, we will integrate it into our main project. So this is no longer the example site, but rather the actual, e-commerce project itself. So if you have any questions on what we did here, please let us know. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next one with that integration, and then we'll see you in the rest of the series. Okay, so now it's time for us to integrate everything we've learned from this Bootstrap stuff into our project. So let's go ahead and look at our project's actual base.html versus our Bootstrap example. So the first and foremost, we want to make sure that our CSS aligns with this Bootstrap, right? We have it. Bootstrap CSS is there. Great. The next thing we want to do is, check all these other things. Looks like we have this meta stuff here. And we do, okay? Those are Bootstrap related, right? Now, of course, we copied and pasted the Bootstrap example already, so that's one thing, but we are just gonna go through one by one on each thing that we actually need to bring over. The next thing is this nav. Notice that I have this big old nav thing here, so I'm gonna go ahead and copy that and jump into navbar.html. Now, again, it's much like what we see on our base.html. We see it in here. And Navbar HTML actually already has the navbar from Bootstrap. We already brought it in. So if I paste this in here, there's really not a whole lot of different things except for maybe the drop-down menu. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that in, and I'll just put it right at the end here. And then I will change the styling from Navbar and bring in the Navbar dark related stuff. So bring that down here. Okay, and then change the brand ever so slightly, and that is by using this image in here. And I just want to have that image there. I don't need to do this, but I want it there, so if I want to change it later, I can, right? So this navbar nav, we just add in that right there, just to make sure that we've got our class lined up correctly. And then finally, the search button, I believe I already have that in there. It looks like I do, all the search form, because we went off of the example. So the navbar stuff should be fine. We saved that, and let's go ahead and just take a look. We go back to our regular site. Ooh, it looks like it's the same, but it's not quite the same, right? So it's not actually inside of that container. So going back into that example, how do we do it? Well, we put the container right in the beginning of it, right? So container here, scroll to the bottom, container there, we save that, a refresh. Now it's back to what we sort of expected. I'm gonna break this open, break it down, awesome. One more thing I've noticed, hey, look at this lack of padding. If I go to contact, lack of padding, or margin rather. So what I wanna do is on my nav bar is I wanna add some margin here. So I'm gonna do MB as in margin bottom, and I'm gonna go ahead and do 3, margin bottom 3. So that should give me a 1 rem. If I refresh in there, now I have some margin. It's looking better, right? Of course, everything's not completely integrated just yet because we still have a lot of work on our Django project itself. But the nav bar is there, right? We actually don't need to do a whole lot else. I've got the nav bar was already there, but Now what we would probably need to do is just structure our content in a little different way, but I'm not going to jump in and just change everything just yet. I want to actually develop more of the site before I really design how it's going to look, right? So when we were doing our Bootstrap example, we kind of already laid out some of the navigation, right? So I put a sidebar here. I put this middle content here. I may or may not want to do that on my homepage, so I'm just not going to do it yet. This is much more about making sure that our navbar functions with the rest of our project. That's really the only integration we have to do because we've already integrated it into Django really simply with, setting up that same sort of base template that they have on their site with our base template, right? And then separate out the CSS and then just making sure our navbar is done correctly. One of the things I do want to mention though is this block content. I'm going to put this inside of a container. So the reason for this is to make sure that all of my content is in this container. It brings in some of the items. So let's go ahead and take a look as to why. That first page is that home page, right? So let's go ahead and find that home page. There it is. And right off the bat, we see that there is this thing for the container. I don't want that anymore. So I have the actual block with the container itself. So I'm going to have to get rid of that one and just keep the row. Just like that. We refresh and it lines back up. Products, it's probably the same in products. It's probably the same in content, or nope, contact view doesn't do anything. Products, if we go into products, we're going to go ahead and change our templates in there. Detail, it's got that container. We don't want that anymore because it's something we're going to use so often. Container, again, don't want that anymore. And then finally, our authentication stuff, we actually probably can improve this by extends base.html and block, do our block content and in block. I'm not going to worry about the form itself, so I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And the registration form looks to be the same. And I'm going to add in, register. And then inside a login, I'll add in login. Okay, we save that, refresh. Now if I go to log out, it does take me to that login page because we haven't really updated that yet. And that's something we still need to do, but our products look different. Everything's just a little bit more aligned in general. So we now are ready to bring in the next portions of Django. If you have any questions on what we did with this integration, please let us know. Otherwise, let's keep going. Hey, thanks so much for watching. I build everything that I can to help you guys launch your projects faster, better, and more often. So please consider subscribing. JoinCFE.com/YouTube is a quick way to our YouTube channel. JoinCFE.com/projects and just JoinCFE.com. That is where all of our stuff is, and I really hope that you join us there as well. Thanks again so much, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.